Long before there were kingdoms, before there were cities, before anyone had written a single word, humanity was already fighting a battle that would determine whether it survived at all. There were no walls to protect people from the cold, no hospitals when disease arrived, no farms capable of producing food on demand, and no machines capable of carrying a person across a dangerous landscape. There was only the body, the mind, the group, and the fire burning in the darkness. For millions of years, our ancestors moved through a world that was constantly changing around them. Forests disappeared and returned. Rivers changed their courses. Animals migrated across enormous distances. Temperatures rose, collapsed, and rose again. And somewhere within this endless struggle, different branches of humanity began to emerge. One of those branches would eventually become us. Another would become the Neanderthals. They would survive for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting their bodies and their behavior to a world of extreme cold, enormous animals, and violent environmental change. They would learn to control fire, manufacture sophisticated tools, hunt dangerous prey, protect their wounded, and bury their dead. They would live through conditions that would be almost impossible for us to imagine. And then, after all those generations, they would disappear. But before we reach that final moment, we have to go back to a time when humanity was still becoming human. The story begins in a world that would look almost alien to us. The earliest members of our human lineage were not living in houses, cities, or even anything resembling a modern settlement. They moved through changing landscapes, searching for food and water while avoiding predators that were faster, stronger, and better armed by nature. Survival depended on recognizing patterns, remembering places, cooperating with others, and learning from experience. The first stone tools appeared millions of years ago, with some evidence dating to around 3.3 million years ago, and more established early tool-making traditions appearing by about 2.6 million years ago. These tools were simple compared with anything a modern human would recognize as technology, but they represented an extraordinary change. A stone could become a cutting edge. A sharp fragment could open an animal hide. A hand stone could break bones and expose the nutritious marrow inside. The human body had not suddenly become stronger, but the human ability to transform the environment had begun. A piece of stone could become an extension of a hand, and the world itself could begin to be reshaped by intelligence. Then came one of the most important discoveries in human history: fire. We cannot point to a single moment and say, this was the day humans discovered fire, because the process happened gradually and over immense periods of time. But evidence of controlled hearths goes back at least hundreds of thousands of years, with some evidence suggesting that cooking may have a much deeper history. Fire changed almost everything. It provided warmth when temperatures dropped. It created light after sunset. It offered protection from some predators. It allowed food to be cooked, making many foods easier to digest and releasing nutrients that would otherwise be harder to access. But fire also created something less obvious: a place for people to gather. In the darkness, members of a group could sit close together around a source of warmth, share food, care for children, repair tools, and remain awake after the sun disappeared. Over generations, the hearth became more than a source of heat. It became a center of human life. As human populations changed, so did their bodies. Different environments rewarded different adaptations. In some places, survival favored mobility and endurance. In others, the ability to cope with cold became increasingly important. Climate was never simply background scenery. It was one of the forces shaping human evolution. Over millions of years, Earth's climate repeatedly shifted between warmer and colder conditions, and these fluctuations became especially pronounced during the later stages of human evolution. Human populations were repeatedly forced to adapt, migrate, or disappear when the environments they depended upon changed. The ability to survive was not always about being the strongest animal in the landscape. Sometimes it was about being able to change when the landscape changed. Eventually, one particular branch of humanity became extraordinarily well adapted to cold environments. The ancestors of the Neanderthals had separated from the lineage leading toward modern humans hundreds of thousands of years ago. Genetic and fossil evidence places this divergence deep in the Middle Pleistocene, although exact dates vary depending on the evidence used. By around 30,000 years ago, fossils from Cima de los Huesos in Spain already carry genetic evidence associated with the Neanderthal lineage. They were not yet identical to the later Neanderthals who would dominate the fossil record, but the evolutionary path was already becoming visible. From this ancient population emerged a human form that would survive through some of the most dramatic climatic changes in the history of our planet. The Neanderthal body tells part of that story. They were shorter and more powerfully built than most modern humans, with compact bodies that helped conserve heat. Their faces were broad, their noses were large, and their skeletons were exceptionally robust. Their brains were not smaller than ours. In absolute terms, Neanderthal brain sizes were often as large as or larger than those of modern humans. Their bodies were not primitive mistakes waiting to be replaced. They were the result of hundreds of thousands of years of adaptation. They belonged to a world in which cold was not an occasional inconvenience. Cold could determine where a group could live, what it could eat, how far it could travel, and whether its children survived the winter. And the world around them was becoming increasingly extreme. The great ice ages were not one continuous period in which the entire planet simply froze. Instead, Earth's climate repeatedly oscillated between colder glacial periods and warmer interglacial periods. Huge ice sheets expanded and retreated. Landscapes changed. Animal populations moved. In some places, forests gave way to open grasslands and tundra-like environments. In others, warmer conditions returned and completely transformed the available resources. For the humans living through these changes, there was no climate forecast and no scientific explanation. They experienced climate change directly through hunger, migration, changing animal behavior, and the disappearance of familiar landscapes. The Neanderthals learned to live inside that instability. When the climate became colder, their hunting strategies changed. When different animals became more common, they changed what they pursued. During colder conditions, they could focus more heavily on cold-adapted prey such as reindeer, while warmer periods brought different animals into their hunting range. When conditions became extremely harsh, populations could shift toward more favorable regions. They were not simply waiting for nature to decide whether they would survive. They were constantly responding to it. Their tools were carefully made, their shelters provided protection, and their clothing helped them survive environments in which an unprotected human body could quickly lose heat. Archaeological evidence indicates that Neanderthals used tools for hunting, processing hides, and sewing or preparing clothing, while their control of fire allowed them to maintain warmth and process food. But perhaps the most remarkable discoveries are not the weapons or the tools. They are the people. Some Neanderthal individuals suffered injuries that would have made independent survival extremely difficult. Yet they lived for years after those injuries, suggesting that other members of their communities cared for them. This means that survival was not purely individual. A wounded hunter could still be part of the group. An older individual could still possess knowledge valuable to everyone else. A child could survive because adults were willing to protect it. The image that emerges is not one of isolated primitive individuals wandering through a frozen landscape. It is one of communities that depended upon cooperation, memory, and shared knowledge. And then there were the dead. At several Neanderthal sites, archaeologists have found evidence consistent with deliberate burial. In some cases, the placement of the bodies and associated materials suggests that the dead were treated intentionally rather than simply left where they died. We cannot know exactly what Neanderthals believed about death. We cannot know whether they imagined an afterlife, remembered ancestors, or performed rituals in ways comparable to later human cultures. But the act itself is powerful. These people did not simply disappear when they died. Someone cared enough to place their bodies somewhere deliberately. Someone may have returned to that place. Someone remembered them. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals continued living through this changing world. Generation after generation learned where to find food, where to shelter from storms, how to make tools, and how to survive the cold. Their existence was not a brief experiment. They were one of the longest-lasting branches of humanity. They lived through repeated climatic changes that would have transformed entire ecosystems, and yet they remained. Their history stretched across so much time that modern civilization, when compared with it, is almost impossibly young. Then another branch of humanity began moving into their world. Homo sapiens had developed in Africa, and eventually some populations began expanding into other regions. The movement was not a single migration, and it did not happen in one generation. It was a long process involving repeated expansions, retreats, and encounters. Eventually, modern humans reached places where Neanderthals had already lived for hundreds of thousands of years. Archaeological evidence indicates that the two populations overlapped for thousands of years in parts of western Eurasia, and some sites provide evidence suggesting that their presence in the same regions was intermittent rather than a simple replacement. This is where the story becomes almost impossible to imagine. Two different human populations were alive at the same time. They looked different. They had different histories. They possessed different traditions, and yet they were close enough to meet. We do not know how their first encounters happened. Perhaps a hunting group discovered unfamiliar footprints. Perhaps one community found an abandoned shelter that had been occupied by another. Perhaps they saw smoke rising from a distant fire and realized that someone else was nearby. There may have been fear. There may have been curiosity. There may have been violence. There may also have been cooperation. Archaeology cannot give us a recording of those meetings, but genetics gives us one extraordinary piece of evidence these populations sometimes had children together. Modern genetic research shows that people whose ancestry lies outside Africa generally carry around 2–3% Neanderthal ancestry. Genomic studies place a major period of admixture between Neanderthals and the ancestors of many modern non-African populations roughly 45,000 to 49,000 years ago. The implication is profound. The boundary between these two branches of humanity was never completely closed. At least some of the people who lived in the same world encountered one another closely enough to merge parts of their genetic histories. But while these encounters were taking place, the climate was continuing to change. The cold returned. The landscapes transformed again. Ice expanded across enormous regions. Animals changed their ranges. Resources became unpredictable. The world that had sustained Neanderthal populations for generations was becoming increasingly unstable. This was not a single frozen apocalypse. There was no one morning when every river became ice and every living creature disappeared beneath snow. Instead, the climate repeatedly shifted, sometimes rapidly, forcing human populations to adapt to a world that could change within the span of a few generations. Imagine a small group living through one of these periods. The wind is stronger now. The nights are longer. The familiar animals are moving farther away. The group has to travel farther to hunt. The old shelter is no longer enough. A child becomes sick. An older hunter can no longer walk as far. The group moves. They find another valley, another cave, another place where firewood can be gathered and animals can still be found. For a while, they survive. Then the environment changes again. This is what makes the final chapter of the Neanderthals so difficult to explain. Their disappearance was probably not caused by one simple event. Population size, climate instability, competition, disease, demographic pressures, and interaction with Homo sapiens may all have contributed. Their numbers appear to have become increasingly limited in the final phases of their existence, and around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappeared from the archaeological record as a distinct population. There was probably no final battlefield, no last army, no dramatic final stand. The end of the human lineage may have been far quieter. A group becomes smaller, a generation becomes older, a hunting ground is abandoned. A child is born into a population that is already struggling to find enough people to survive. Another community arrives. Some individuals die. Others move. Some may have had children with Homo sapiens. And eventually, there are simply no more Neanderthal communities recognizable in the archaeological record. The fires go out. The shelters become empty. The tools remain on the ground. Then snow covers them. The landscape freezes over, and for thousands of years, the world forgets. What makes the story extraordinary is that the Neanderthals were not forgotten forever. Their bones remained buried beneath the ground, waiting for a future species to discover them. The first recognized Neanderthal fossils were found in the 19th century, and when scientists began studying them, they realized they were looking at something unlike any human remains they had previously seen. The fossils forced scientists to confront a revolutionary possibility. Humanity had not always consisted of a single kind of human. There had been others. The human family had once been much larger. Then science went deeper. In 1997, researchers published the first analysis of Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA from the original Neanderthal specimen found in Germany. For the first time, scientists could compare genetic material from an extinct human population with that of living people. The result confirmed that Neanderthals were extremely close relatives of modern humans, but represented a distinct branch of the human family tree. More than a decade later, scientists achieved something that once seemed almost impossible. They sequenced the Neanderthal genome. Now the story could be read not only in bones and stone, but in DNA. And the genetic evidence revealed something extraordinary. The Neanderthals were gone, but they were not completely gone. Their genetic legacy had survived. It passed through generations of Homo sapiens and reached people living thousands of years later. The discovery changed the story from one of simple extinction into something much stranger. The Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population, but part of their history became embedded within another human population that survived. Their genes crossed the boundary between two branches of humanity. Their bodies disappeared. Their culture disappeared. Their shelters disappeared. But pieces of their biological history continued. And perhaps that is why the final image of the Neanderthal should not be a skeleton frozen inside a cave. It should be a fire. A small fire burning in darkness. Around it, a family sits together. Someone repairs a tool. Someone prepares food. Someone watches over a child. Outside, the world is becoming colder. The wind moves across the frozen landscape. Snow begins to cover the ground. The people around the fire do not know that their descendants will not inherit their world. They do not know that another branch of humanity will eventually become dominant. They do not know that thousands of generations later, scientists will uncover their bones and reconstruct their faces. They do not know that machines will one day read fragments of their DNA. They do not know that people living in a completely different world will carry pieces of their ancestry inside their cells. All they know is the fire, the cold, the people beside them, and the next morning, eventually, that fire goes out. The shelter is abandoned. The last generation disappears. The landscape closes over what remains, and the world continues. Thousands of years pass. Then, tens of thousands. The frozen landscapes retreat. Animals change. Human civilizations eventually rise. People build villages, then cities, then roads, then machines, then laboratories capable of reaching backward through time. And inside those laboratories, scientists begin to discover that the people they thought had vanished without a trace left something behind. A genetic signature, a fragment, an active. The Neanderthals were not the first humans. They were not the only humans. And they were not simply a failed version of us. They were another answer to the same question that every human population has faced since the beginning. How do you survive when the world changes? They answered that question with powerful bodies, fire, tools, cooperation, memory, and adaptation. For hundreds of thousands of years, it worked. Until one day, it didn't. The cold world changed. Human populations changed. The balance changed. And the Neanderthals disappeared. But perhaps extinction is not always as absolute as we imagine. Because when we look at a modern human being today, we are looking at the survivor of a very long story. A story filled with species that disappeared, populations that migrated, families that crossed paths, and ancient people who left pieces of themselves behind. The Neanderthals are gone. Their fires are cold. Their shelters have collapsed. Their footsteps had disappeared beneath thousands of years of soil and ice. But their story is still written inside humanity. And somewhere within us, a tiny fragment of that ancient world remains, a reminder that before we built civilizations, before we conquered continents, before we looked beyond our planet, humanity was already here, standing beside a fire, waiting for the cold to pass.